My name is Lyra Corbin. For as long as I can remember, my life has been shaped by the quiet spaces between words, by the subtle cadence of a language most people around me didn't understand. I grew up in a small, book-filled house where the air was perpetually scented with cardamom and rosewater, a legacy of my grandmother, my Maman Bozorg. She had come from Shiraz, a city of poets and gardens, and she carried its soul with her like a precious perfume. She taught me Farsi not with flashcards and grammar drills, but through stories whispered over steaming cups of black tea, through the intricate verses of Hafez she would recite while kneading dough for Nooni Berberi, and through the gentle cadence of her prayers at dawn. For her, Farsi wasn't just a language, it was a vessel for memory, for love, for a world of profound hospitality and unspoken understanding. Words can build bridges or walls, Lyra Jan, she would tell me, her fingers tracing the delicate patterns on a Persian rug. The most important ones are often the quietest. I carried that lesson with me into my adult life. I live in Seattle, a city that understands the beauty of quiet persistence. The near-constant drizzle feels less like an inconvenience and more like a gentle, cleansing hush. My apartment overlooks a sliver of the Puget Sound, and on most mornings, a soft gray mist blankets the water, blurring the line between sea and sky. It's a landscape that encourages introspection, and for a long time, it felt like the perfect backdrop for my work. For 12 years, I was a senior cultural liaison for Viridian Dynamics, a massive tech firm with a gleaming downtown headquarters that felt more like a monument to ambition than a place for people. My official role was to manage our partnerships in the Persian Gulf, specifically with a handful of high-value, family-run conglomerates in Iran that specialized in artisan crafts scaled for the global luxury market. It was a niche, delicate market that Viridian had stumbled into and never quite understood, but the revenue it generated was significant enough that they left me to it. They saw my role as one of simple translation. They believed I was just converting English emails to Farsi and back again. They never knew about the late-night calls, time to respect the weekend in Tehran, where I would speak not with a procurement officer, but with the venerable patriarch of the Jamshidi family himself. They never understood that our most successful contract, an $8 million annual agreement for hand-woven silks and intricate ceramics, was secured not with a killer PowerPoint presentation, but over a long, meandering conversation about the symbolism of the pomegranate in Sufi poetry. My work was my grandmother's lesson made manifest. I built bridges. Quietly, patiently, and with a deep respect for the nuances that spreadsheets could never capture. I was reliable, consistent, and, because my work was seamless, I became invisible. I was a legacy employee, a line item from a previous era, and in the relentless drive for modernization, I was about to be streamlined. The meeting with no name. It began, as these things often do, with the chilling anonymity of a calendar invitation. It appeared on a Tuesday morning, a stark block of blue in my otherwise predictable schedule. The subject line was empty. The location was a conference room on the 40th floor, a sterile glass box I rarely visited, reserved for executive decisions. The sender was a generic admin HR alias. Attendance was marked as mandatory. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. This wasn't a project review. Project reviews had agendas, attachments, and were scheduled by people I knew. This was a summons. The silence of the invitation spoke volumes. I spent the next hour in a strange state of calm detachment. I answered 2 emails from Mr. Jamshidi's youngest son, confirming shipping logistics. I reviewed a draft of a new proposal, adding my handwritten notes in the margins, not just translations, but cultural advisories. Use the word partnership instead of synergy, I wrote. Avoid timelines that seem too aggressive. It implies a lack of faith in the process. These were the small, crucial details that had kept our relationships intact for over a decade. At 10:55 a.m., I took the elevator up. The ride was silent, the mirrored walls reflecting a woman who looked composed, her dark hair pulled back neatly, her simple gray dress unadorned. But inside, I felt the floor dropping away. I walked into conference room 40B at exactly 11 o'clock. The air was chilled and smelled of industrial cleaner. Grant Caldwell, the new chief operating officer, was already there, standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to the door. He was a man who seemed assembled from a catalog of corporate ambition: sharp suit, expensive watch, a haircut that was aggressively neat. He communicated in buzzwords and believed data was the only language of truth. Sitting at the long, polished table was Helen from Human Resources, a woman with kind eyes that always seemed to be apologizing for the job she had to do. She offered me a tight, sympathetic smile that didn't reach them. I sat down, placing my hands in my lap. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Grant finally turned, his expression a carefully curated mask of professional regret. "Lyra," he began, his voice smooth and devoid of any real warmth. "Thank you for joining us. As you know, Viridian is undergoing a significant strategic realignment. We're optimizing our operational model to enhance agility and focus on our core growth sectors." I listened, my face impassive. It was a speech I'd heard him give at a recent all-hands meeting. It was a meaningless collage of corporate jargon designed to obscure a simple, brutal reality. He gestured vaguely toward the window, as if the entire city were his to reconfigure. "In this new structure, we've had to make some difficult decisions. We've evaluated all roles, and unfortunately, your position as a cultural liaison has been identified as redundant." Redundant. The word hung in the air, clinical and dismissive. It suggested I was a spare part, an unnecessary duplication. It completely erased the unique, irreplaceable nature of what I did. 12 years of building trust, of navigating complex cultural landscapes, of securing deals that the mainstream sales teams couldn't even get a foothold in, all of it redundant. I glanced at Helen. Her gaze fell to the file in front of her. She couldn't look at me. Grant continued, his tone unwavering. "We're moving towards a more streamlined, automated translation software and leveraging our global sales force for client relations. It's a more scalable and cost-effective model." He had no idea. He genuinely believed that a piece of software could replicate a relationship nurtured over a decade. He thought a salesperson from the London office, armed with a glossy brochure, could have a conversation about the poetry of Rumi with a man who considered such things the very foundation of trust. No one asked who would handle the delicate renegotiation of the Jamshidi family's exclusivity clause, which was coming up in 2 months. No one asked who understood that Mr. Jamshidi preferred to be called by his first name, Farid, but only after the 3rd meeting, as a sign of established respect. No one seemed to realize that the latest contract, worth a potential $30 million over 5 years, was held together not by legal clauses, but by my personal assurance to the family that Viridian understood and valued their heritage. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. What would be the point? They had already made their decision based on a spreadsheet that couldn't quantify trust, honor, or human connection. To fight would be to validate their process, to imply that my value was something that could be debated in this cold, sterile room. My grandmother's voice echoed in my mind. "Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all." Helen slid a thick manila envelope across the table. "Lyra, this contains all the details of your severance package, benefits, and the transition process," she said softly. Her voice was the only human sound in the room. I stood up, my movements deliberate. I smoothed the fabric of my dress and looked directly at Grant Caldwell for the first time. He met my gaze for a fraction of a second before it darted away, towards the safety of his panoramic view. He couldn't hold it. "Good luck with the new model, Grant," I said, my voice even and calm. He cleared his throat. "Thank you, Lyra. We wish you the best in your future endeavors." It was a line delivered by rote, as meaningless as the rest of his speech. I nodded once, took the envelope, and walked out of the room. I didn't look back. As the elevator doors slid shut, I wasn't filled with anger or despair. Instead, a strange, quiet clarity washed over me. They hadn't just fired an employee. They had dismantled a bridge, and they didn't even know it was the only way across the chasm. They thought they had cut away dead weight, but they had severed a root, and they would only notice when the tree began to wither. The things they never knew. They never knew about the first time I spoke with Farid Jamshidi. It wasn't in a boardroom. It was on a crackling phone line for years into my tenure at Viridian. His father, the original patriarch, had just passed away, and the company was in a state of flux. Viridian's then CEO, a man who at least had a semblance of worldly wisdom, had been ready to pull out, fearing instability. "Let me just call him," I had said. Not as Viridian, but as Lyra. I didn't talk about contracts or supply chains. I offered my condolences in Farsi, using the formal, respectful language reserved for mourning. I told him a short story my grandmother had told me about how the spirits of our ancestors live on in the gardens we tend. We spoke for an hour about his father, about poetry, about the challenges of honoring tradition in a modern world. At the end of the call, he said, "Lyra Jan, my father said you had a good heart." He was right. "We will continue to work with your company because you are there." They never knew that the Jan he added to my name was not a formality. It was a term of endearment, of familial affection. In that culture, it was a bond stronger than any legal document. They never knew that I kept a separate set of notebooks, filled not with sales figures, but with personal details. The birthday of Mr. Jamshidi's wife. The name of his eldest daughter's university in Canada. The fact that his youngest son was a gifted painter. These weren't data points to be exploited. They were the threads of human connection that wove our professional relationship into a tapestry of mutual respect. When we sent a gift to celebrate the birth of his first grandchild, it wasn't a generic corporate basket. It was a rare, illustrated book of children's fables from a small press in my neighborhood, a gift I had chosen myself. The thank you note I received was not addressed to Viridian Dynamics, but to me. They saw my expense reports for Farsi literature and artisan teas and likely classified them as miscellaneous indulgences. They didn't understand that these were my tools of diplomacy. Reading the poets that Mr. Jamshidi loved allowed me to understand his worldview. Sharing a cup of the same tea he drank, even an ocean away, was a gesture of solidarity. What they saw on their dashboards were 3 major Iranian accounts, steadily performing, with high retention rates. They saw renewal dates and revenue projections. They assumed it was a simple, repeatable process. They looked at my salary, my title, my years of service, and saw a cost center. An artifact of an older, less efficient way of doing business. They saw a woman who was quiet in meetings, who didn't trumpet her successes, who simply did the work. They never asked how the renewal rate was 100%. They never asked why the Jamshidi family had turned down a more lucrative offer from a German competitor 2 years prior. They never asked what I did on my evenings and weekends that kept those bridges so strong. They didn't ask, so I never told them. My value wasn't in the reports I filed, it was in the trust one had cultivated. And trust, once broken, cannot be realigned or optimized. It simply vanishes. As I packed the few personal items from my desk, a small, framed photo of my grandmother, a hand-painted tile from Isfahan, my worn copy of Hafez, I felt a pang of sadness, not for myself, but for them. For their profound and costly ignorance. They were about to learn the difference between a transaction and a relationship, and it was going to be a very expensive lesson. A silence to heal. The first 2 days were a blur of quiet rituals. I didn't open the severance envelope. I didn't log onto social media to see if there was any gossip. I didn't call friends to vent my anger. Instead, I reclaimed my space. I unplugged the company laptop, the source of a low, persistent hum I hadn't even noticed until it was gone, and packed it away. The silence it left behind was deep and restorative. I spent an entire afternoon cleaning my apartment. I washed the windows until the gray Seattle light streamed in, soft and unfiltered. I dusted every book on my shelves, my fingers lingering on the spines of my grandmother's poetry collections. I brewed a large pot of black tea, steeping it with dried lime and a stick of cinnamon, filling my small kitchen with a scent that was wholly mine, unconnected to deadlines or corporate expectations. It was a cleansing, a way of scrubbing away the invisible residue of a place that had ultimately decided I didn't belong. On the 3rd day, a Saturday, the rain finally stopped. The sun broke through the clouds, casting a watery, golden light over the sound. I put on my walking shoes and headed down to the waterfront. I walked for hours, with no destination in mind, watching the ferries glide across the water and the gulls circle overhead. The cold, salty air filled my lungs, and with each step, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to unclench. I had given 12 years of my life to Viridian. I had poured my heart, my heritage, and my quietest, most thoughtful energy into my work. And in less than 10 minutes, it had been erased. The hurt was there, a dull ache beneath the surface, but it was surprisingly free of bitterness. It was the clean pain of a wound, not the festering poison of resentment. They hadn't seen me. It was that simple. And perhaps, I realized as I watched the sun dip below the Olympic Mountains, I had allowed myself to become invisible. I had been so focused on being the bridge for others that I had forgotten to be a destination for myself. That evening, I finally sat down with my old notebooks. Not the official Viridian ones, but my personal journals. They were filled with my grandmother's proverbs, with my own translations of Farsi poems, with notes on the subtle differences between the dialect in Tehran and the one in Shiraz. I saw sketches of tile patterns, lists of symbolic flowers, and reflections on conversations with Farid Jamshidi and his family. Flipping through those pages, I wasn't looking at a job. I was looking at a vocation. A calling. This wasn't just a skill I possessed, it was a part of who I was. Viridian hadn't taken that from me. They had only taken the title, the salary, the cubicle. They had freed me from the container, but the contents were still mine. All mine. On Monday morning, an email landed in my personal inbox. It was from a woman I'd met a year ago at a sustainable business conference. Her name was Sonia Beltran, the founder of a boutique consulting firm called Luminara Partners. They worked with companies to build ethical and culturally resonant global strategies. I remembered her vividly. While everyone else was networking with a frantic energy, Sonia had been quiet, observant. She had asked me not about my company's market share, but about the story behind the Isfahan tiles I had mentioned in my panel discussion. She had been interested in the why. Her email was brief and direct. Subject, a thought. Dear Lyra, I heard through the grapevine you might be exploring new horizons. I was so impressed by your perspective when we met, and I've thought of our conversation many times since. We're building something different at Luminara. We believe that culture isn't a barrier to overcome, but a bridge to build. It's a philosophy I think you share. If you're open to it, I'd love to have a conversation. Warmly, Sonia. I read the email twice. There were no buzzwords. No talk of synergy or optimization. Just simple, human words, perspective, conversation, philosophy, bridge. While Grant Caldwell was likely preparing for a meeting he thought he could handle with a new software and a generic sales pitch, I was looking at an invitation to build something new, with someone who already saw the value in what I did. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to see Viridian fail. I just needed to be seen. I wrote back immediately, and we scheduled a video call for the following day. A small, hopeful light began to flicker in the quiet space that Viridian had left behind. The shift wasn't happening in their sterile boardrooms. It was happening right here, in my sunlit living room, with a cup of tea in my hand and the future feeling, for the first time in a long time, like an open page. The meeting they could not hold. I heard about what happened that Monday from Leo, a junior analyst from my old team. He was a sweet, earnest young man who had always been fascinated by my work and had called me, his voice a mixture of awe and horror, to give me a play-by-play. Viridian had pulled out all the stops. They had redecorated the executive conference room, replacing their usual stark, modern art with what they probably thought were tasteful ethnic prints. Leo mentioned someone had even ordered a special catering service, resulting in trays of lukewarm saffron-infused water and pastries that were beautifully arranged but culturally tone-deaf. It was a pantomime of respect, a performance for an audience that could spot a counterfeit a mile away. At precisely 9 a.m., Mr. Farid Jamshidi and his delegation arrived. They were, as always, impeccably dressed and carried an aura of quiet, unshakable dignity. Grant Caldwell greeted them with a wide, practiced smile, his hand outstretched. Leo said Mr. Jamshidi gave a polite, formal nod but didn't take it. They were led into the conference room. Grant launched into his presentation, the slides filled with charts and projections, a dazzling display of data that said absolutely nothing about what truly mattered. He spoke of next-generation logistics, synergistic partnerships, and a new era of global efficiency. According to Leo, Mr. Jamshidi listened patiently, his hands resting on the table, his expression unreadable. His two advisors sat silently beside him. A translator, a young man hired for the day, sat slightly behind them, looking nervous. When Grant finally paused for a breath, expecting questions about his data, a profound silence filled the room. Mr. Jamshidi didn't look at the screen. He looked around the room, his gaze sweeping over the unfamiliar faces, the awkward decor, the forced hospitality. Then he turned to Grant Caldwell and, in a soft, clear voice that cut through the corporate jargon like a knife, he asked a simple question in English. "Where is Lyra Jan?" Leo said the air went out of the room. The question was so direct, so personal, it shattered the entire facade. The use of Jan, that small, powerful suffix of endearment, was not lost. It wasn't a business inquiry. It was the question of a friend looking for a trusted friend. Grant was visibly flustered. His professional mask slipped. "Miss Corbin," he stammered, his smile faltering. "Ah, yes. Lyra is no longer with Viridian Dynamics. As part of our restructuring, her role was..." He didn't get to finish. Mr. Jamshidi held up a hand, a small, graceful gesture that nonetheless commanded complete authority. "I see," he said. The two words were layered with centuries of meaning, disappointment, understanding, and a final, quiet judgment. He then spoke a few short sentences in Farsi to his advisors. The hired translator, flustered, began to stammer, he says that the foundation of your house appears to be, but Mr. Jamshidi was already standing. His advisors rose with him. The meeting, which was scheduled for 3 hours, was over in less than 15 minutes. Grant, in a panic, rushed forward. "Mr. Jamshidi, please, we have a fully vetted team ready to handle the transition. Our new systems are state-of-the-art." Mr. Jamshidi turned at the door, his gaze finally settling on Grant with a look of profound pity. "Trust is the thread, Mr. Caldwell," he said, his English precise and deliberate. "It is woven over years of careful, quiet work. It is not a line item you can reallocate. Once you cut it, the pattern is ruined." And with that, they were gone. They left behind a room filled with expensive, untouched food, a useless PowerPoint presentation frozen on the screen, and a silence that was more damning than any angry outburst could ever have been. Leo told me that after they left, Grant just stood there, staring at the empty doorway, his face pale. The COO, the man of data and agility, had no protocol for this. There was no metric for the loss of trust. There was no algorithm to fix a broken relationship. Later that afternoon, an internal memo went out, vaguely citing a shift in priorities with our Persian Gulf partners and announcing that the expansion project was on hold indefinitely. No mention of the disastrous meeting. No mention of the $30 million deal that had just evaporated into thin air. No mention of me. But they didn't have to. As I sat in my quiet apartment, listening to Leo's story, I felt no triumph, no desire for revenge. Just a deep, resonant sadness for their blindness. They had owned a bridge, a beautiful, sturdy bridge built of respect and understanding, and in their haste to modernize, they had torn it down without ever knowing its true value. "No, I won't go back." The first call came on Wednesday. It was from Grant Caldwell's direct line. I recognized the number and let it go to voicemail. The message he left was a masterpiece of corporate evasion. "Lyra, Grant Caldwell here. I'm calling to touch base. There have been some recent developments regarding our international partnerships, and we believe there may be an opportunity for a collaborative discussion. We'd greatly value your perspective. Please give me a call back at your earliest convenience." Perspective. The same perspective they had deemed redundant just a week ago. The word was so hollow, so transparently desperate. He didn't say, "We made a terrible mistake." He didn't say, "We need you." He was still trying to frame it as if they were doing me a favor, offering me a seat at a discussion. I deleted the message. The next day, an email arrived. This time it was from Helen in HR. It was more formal, more direct, but still shrouded in the same cautious language. Subject: follow-up conversation. Dear Lyra, following up on Grant's message, Viridian would like to officially open a dialogue about a potential consulting arrangement to support our transition with key international accounts. We are prepared to be very flexible on the terms of compensation and scope of work. We believe your unique expertise would be invaluable in ensuring continuity. Please let us know when would be a good time to connect. Sincerely, Helen. Invaluable. Another word that had no place in the vocabulary of my firing. They were throwing money at the problem, hoping to buy back the trust they had so carelessly thrown away. But trust isn't a commodity. My work had never been about the money. It had been about the meaning. They still didn't understand. I didn't respond. My silence wasn't a negotiating tactic. It was a statement of fact. That chapter was closed. I had already turned the page. While they were scrambling, I was having my second conversation with Sonia Beltran at Luminera Partners. We weren't talking about damage control. We were talking about creation. We sketched out a new role for me, something we called a cultural architect. It wasn't about translation. It was about designing business strategies from the ground up that were rooted in cultural empathy and mutual respect. It was everything I had been doing implicitly at Viridian, but now it would be the explicit foundation of my work. It felt like coming home. On Friday, a courier delivered a thick envelope to my apartment. It was from Viridian's legal department. Inside was a formal, preemptive consulting offer. The financial terms were staggering, more than double my old salary, structured as a short-term contract. It was a panic offer. It was blood money, meant to patch the artery they had severed. I sat with it for a long time, not tempted, but contemplative. I thought about what it would feel like to walk back into that building, to sit across from Grant Caldwell, to be the fixer for a mess of their own making. A wave of profound exhaustion washed over me at the thought. Going back would mean shrinking myself again, fitting back into a box I had just escaped. It would mean teaching them a lesson they should have already known, and my soul was no longer in the business of tutoring the willfully blind. I took out a piece of my own stationery, the one with a simple, embossed gardenia, my grandmother's favorite flower. I wrote a short, simple note. Dear Grant and Helen, thank you for your recent outreach and the offer extended. I appreciate you thinking of me. However, my path has taken a different direction, and I will be unable to assist you. My work is now focused on building new bridges, not repairing old ones. I wish you all the best. Sincerely, Lyra Corbin. I sealed the envelope and put a stamp on it. I would mail it tomorrow. There was no anger in the words, no lingering resentment. Just a quiet, unshakable finality. It was the gentlest, kindest, most definitive no I had ever written. They didn't need a consultant. They needed a time machine. And I was moving forward. New terms, new light. The letter was a formality, an act of closure for myself more than a message for them. My real answer was in my actions. The following Monday, I officially accepted the offer from Luminera Partners. I didn't walk into a sterile high-rise, but a beautifully converted brick warehouse in Fremont, with high ceilings, abundant natural light, and the gentle hum of collaborative energy. The air smelled of fresh coffee and old books. My new role was a universe away from the one I'd left. Sonia didn't see me as a liaison to a niche market. She saw me as a cornerstone of the firm's entire philosophy. We don't just want you to manage relationships, Lyra, she told me during our first strategy session, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. We want you to teach us. Help us embed this way of thinking into our DNA. Your perspective is our future. My first project was not about salvaging a failing account. It was about co-creating a new one. Luminera was in early talks with a consortium of artisans in Oaxaca, Mexico, who were looking to bring their traditional weaving to a global audience without compromising their cultural integrity. I didn't speak Spanish, but Sonia hadn't hired me for my language skills alone. She'd hired me for my methodology, for the deep listening, the patient trust building, the respect for heritage. I spent my days researching Oaxacan history, learning about Zapotec symbolism, and having long, thoughtful video calls with the matriarch of the weaving cooperative, a woman named Sophia, with the help of a local interpreter. I wasn't there to impose a business model. I was there to listen to their story and help them find a way to tell it to the world. It was work that filled my soul. About a month into my new role, an email appeared in my inbox. The sender was Farhad Jamshidi. Subject: a new season. My dear Lyra Jan, I hope this message finds you in peace and good health. I was saddened to hear of your departure from your previous position. A garden without its most dedicated gardener is a sorrowful thing. I have been told you are now with a new firm, Luminera Partners. A name that suggests light. This is fitting. Our family has decided to explore new partnerships in North America. We are looking for a home built on a foundation of respect, not just commerce. Perhaps your new home would be open to a conversation. With the warmest regards, Farhad. I read his email with a warmth spreading through my chest. The relationship hadn't been with Viridian Dynamics. It had been with me. The trust hadn't been in their logo. It had been in my voice, in my understanding, in the bridge I had so carefully tended. And when I had left, the bridge had left with me. I walked into Sonia's office, my laptop in hand, and showed her the email. She read it, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. She didn't see a lucrative contract. She saw a confirmation of everything she was trying to build. Well, Lyra Corbin, she said, her eyes shining. It looks like your garden is starting to follow you. We did not draft a contract to send to Mr. Jamshidi. Instead, I wrote a simple reply, inviting him and his family to a virtual tea. Not a meeting, but a conversation. We would talk about his family, my new work, the changing seasons. We would begin again, on new ground, under a new light. I never heard from Viridian again. I imagine they eventually wrote off the loss, burying it under layers of corporate restructuring and blaming it on market volatility. Grant Caldwell probably convinced himself and the board that the region was unstable and that they had made the right call to pull back. It's easier to invent a fiction than to face the simple, devastating truth. They had no idea what they had lost until it was gone. But their story was no longer my concern. I was too busy learning, growing, and building. I was working with people who didn't need to lose me to see my value. They saw it from the start. The bridge I became. Sometimes, on a quiet Seattle morning when the mist hangs low over the water, I think about the two paths. The one I was on and the one I am on now. At Viridian, I was a quiet caretaker of a bridge someone else had built. My job was to maintain it, to patch the cracks, to ensure traffic flowed smoothly. I was essential, but I was also infrastructure, taken for granted and, ultimately, seen as replaceable. When they decided the bridge was obsolete, they didn't realize I wasn't just its keeper. I was its architect, its memory, its very soul. They could not replace me with a newer, shinier model because what I provided wasn't a service, it was a relationship. Today, I am no longer just tending bridges. At Luminera, I am helping to design them from the ground up. My work is not a silent, background process. It is the conversation at the very center of the room. My grandmother's wisdom, once a private source of strength, is now a guiding principle for an entire company. I learned something profound from that painful, quiet ending at Viridian. My worth is not determined by a job title or a line on an organizational chart. It is not something that can be given or taken away by a COO with a spreadsheet. My value is inherent. It lives in my heritage, in my perspective, in the quiet, patient way I move through the world. The Jamshidi family is now Luminera's most significant partner. Our work together is not just about commerce, it's a beautiful, thriving collaboration that honors their legacy while building a sustainable future. Farhad and I still have our long talks about poetry, but now Sonia often joins us, listening with genuine curiosity and respect. I never sought revenge on Viridian. I never had to. Their own lack of vision was a more fitting consequence than any I could have engineered. The silence that followed my departure, the deals that evaporated, the relationships that withered, that was simply the natural result of their own actions. They didn't just lose a multi-million-dollar account, they lost the capacity to understand why. My story is not one of vengeance, but of evolution. It's about the quiet power of being underestimated. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound transformations don't begin with a loud declaration, but with a quiet closing of a door. You don't always need to fight to be seen. Sometimes, you just need to walk away and let your absence speak. Looking out at the water now, I don't see a landscape of mist and uncertainty. I see a world of infinite possibility. The bridge to my past wasn't burned. I had simply crossed it and continued on my way toward a horizon that was brighter, clearer, and entirely my own.